All right, friends, welcome to another edition of Justice Matters One-on-One. I am really thrilled to have with me today the former pardon attorney for the United States at the Department of Justice, Liz Oyer. I wish we had better and happier news to discuss because Liz was not only the pardon attorney, and she's going to talk a little bit about what that means and what her work involved, but she was also a 10-year federal public defender. And even though I was a career prosecutor, I always gave huge props to all criminal defense attorneys, but particularly public defenders, both local and federal, because of the enormously important work they did. And I want to touch on that a little bit toward the end of our conversation today. But let me start by saying that Liz was appointed as the pardon attorney, I believe, in 2022. As I said, prior to that, she spent a decade as a federal public defender in Maryland and has also worked in private practice. And Liz, first of all, thank you for joining us and being willing to kind of tell your story about what you experienced as the pardon attorney, recently under the Trump administration.
Thank you very much for having me, Glenn. I'm glad to be here to talk with you.
Can you start, Liz, by just explaining for our viewers a little bit about what the Office of the Pardon Attorney does?
Yeah, so the Office of the Pardon Attorney is a smaller office within the Department of Justice, about 40 staff members, and our job is to review applications for clemency that are coming in from around the country and to make recommendations to the president. We get two main kinds of applications. The majority are requests for commutation of sentence, so reduction of prison sentence from people who are incarcerated throughout the United States. And then we also get requests for pardons, which generally come from people who have completed their sentence and have returned to the community. The role of the office is to ensure that people who don't have political connections, who don't have money to hire attorneys and lobbyists, who don't have that kind of inside access, can still have their clemency applications considered. And we got thousands of applications each year, many thousands of applications each year. And our job was to make sure that the deserving ones ended up on the president's desk.
And I was going to ask you that, roughly ballpark, how many applications for commutations or pardons did you receive each year? And it sounds like the caseloads of the attorneys assigned to the Office of the Pardon Attorney were probably pretty crushing.
Yeah, in the last few months of my service, toward the end of the Biden administration and then the early months of the Trump administration, we were receiving maybe about 1,000 applications per month, really very large numbers. During my time in the office, we made recommendations in over 15,000 cases. So, it is a very large caseload. There are lots of deserving people out there who have applications pending. And right now, those applications do not have a path forward to the president, unfortunately.
So there has not been a new head of the Pardon Attorney's Office appointed?
So there hasn't been a new pardon attorney appointed. And as of the time that I left, there really weren't even any communications happening between the Office of the Pardon Attorney and the White House, which is very unusual and very unfortunate for those who don't have access to the White House through the front door and are really relying on that ordinary process to give them a shot.
Hmm. So I'd like you to share with our viewers the circumstances of your termination, your firing. And I both read your account and then I had the pleasure of attending the recent bicameral hearing of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees at which you testified a few weeks ago. And I listened to your story again. And as a career public servant for more than 30 years, it still just sort of knocks the justice wind out of me that our department of my beloved Department of Justice, my professional home for decades, is treating people the way they are. So can you just talk a little bit about how you were terminated?
Yeah, so it's coming up on 2 months ago that I was fired. I was fired on a Friday afternoon. I was in a meeting with the heads of other DOJ components with a lot of folks from different offices, and uh, a member of my staff pulled me out of the meeting and told me that there were security officers waiting in my office to deliver me termination papers and escort me out of the building. I was not given any explanation or any reason for my firing. I was given a very short 3 sentence memo from Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General. I packed up my stuff into a grocery bag and was on my way out the door the afternoon of March the 7th. Uh, so they've never told me why I was fired, but there are some things that happened in the days leading up to my firing, and I'm happy to talk about those.
Yeah, please. I'd like to hear about it. I'm assuming you mean the Mel Gibson restoration of firearms rights, which again, this sounds like the stuff of Hollywood, but this is real life under the Trump administration.
Yeah. So when the new leadership of the department came in late January, early February, it became clear that the use of the resources of the Office of the Pardon Attorney was going to change. We were tasked with a project that had to do with restoring gun rights to Americans who had lost their right to possess a firearm due to a criminal conviction. There are upward of 25 million people in that situation who would potentially be eligible for this type of relief. So this was sort of a massive project that was put on our plate, and it appeared that this was really going to be the future work of the Office of the Pardon Attorney.
And I don't
I,
mean to interrupt you, but
yeah, sure.
was working on requests for restoration of firearms rights something the Office of the Pardon Attorney had done traditionally?
Absolutely not. I mean, this was a totally new work stream for us, not something that we had ever had any role in before.
Okay.
But nevertheless, we were committed to working with the new leadership to accomplish the objectives that they had and to try to find a path forward for the important work of clemency. So we took this on. And one of the things that was asked of me was to identify some individuals who would make good candidates for this relief of restoring their gun rights, to whom the Attorney General could grant restoration of firearm rights. And my understanding was that in connection with an announcement of the broader program, she wanted to also announce some individuals who were getting their right to possess a gun back. So what we did was we looked at our pool of pardon applicants and we looked at the ones who were fully vetted by the FBI. When someone is seeking a presidential pardon, one of the effects of that is that if they get a pardon, they can lawfully purchase a firearm. So we very carefully vet applicants who were considering as good candidates for pardon to ensure that there are no flags that would suggest that they would present a danger to the community. So we looked at that vetted pool of individuals and we identified quite a few who had stated somewhere in their application that they were seeking a pardon, at least in part, to get their gun rights back. So we provided those names to the folks in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General, and they whittled that list of about 95 down to 9 people that they liked. And then they asked me to write a memo recommending that the Attorney General restore the firearm rights of those individuals. So I prepared that memo, which I was asked to make because, I had a lot of information about all of those individuals, and they were all folks who had been convicted of low-level nonviolent crimes, and those offenses occurred decades ago, and they had extensive, lengthy records of rehabilitation and good conduct in the community in the decades since their conviction. So I didn't have any concerns about those individuals. I wrote that memo, and within probably an hour of sending that memo to the Deputy Attorney General's staff, I got a request back to add Mel Gibson to the recommendation. Now, Mel Gibson, I had apparently his attorney had submitted a memo to then the acting Attorney General and the acting Deputy Attorney General saying essentially that Mr. Gibson is a friend of the president. He was appointed as some sort of ambassador by the president, ambassador to Hollywood. And he had previously tried to purchase a gun, but was denied because he had a conviction in 2011 for domestic violence in which he had assaulted his girlfriend. So, based on the relationship with the president and the fact that he was a famous actor who had made some high profile movies, his attorney contended that he was a good candidate to get his gun rights back. So, I was asked, based on that information, to make a recommendation to the attorney general that she restore the gun rights of Mel Gibson. I was not able to make that recommendation because I had serious concerns about the implications of restoring firearm rights to individuals with domestic violence histories. And at minimum, I believed we would need quite a bit of additional information and investigation to be able to make a recommendation that someone like Mr. Gibson with that type of history could safely get his gun rights back. So I communicated to the Office of the Deputy Attorney General that I could not make that recommendation. I then received a call from a staff member in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General who initially asked me if my position on Mr. Gibson was flexible. On hearing that it was not flexible, he essentially told me that Mr. Gibson was a friend of the president and that should be sufficient information for me to make the recommendation and that I would be wise to make the recommendation. From his tone, it was very clear that this was a highly consequential moment for my future at the Department of Justice. It was clear that it was going to be a problem if I was not able to make the recommendation that was being asked of me. So I told him I would think about it, and I thought about it overnight. I had a sleepless night in which I weighed the options, what I could do. I understood the magnitude of what was being asked. And the following morning, I revised the initial memo. What I did was I added the information that had been provided by Mr. Gibson's attorney, and I took out the recommendation piece of it. I said, essentially, here are some candidates who've been vetted by my office. Here's a candidate who has not been vetted, and here's what his attorney says, and sent that along in sort of purely informational form. That was the morning of Friday, March the 7th. And 2 o'clock that afternoon, when I was in this meeting, is when I learned that I was being fired.
And I was going to ask you, what was the time between your decision not to recommend restoration of gun rights and your termination?
Yeah, it was just a few hours. I don't have all these documents any longer, but I would estimate it was probably like 9 or 10 in the morning when I sent the revised memo. And by 2 p.m., I was on my way out the door.
And had anybody ever expressed dissatisfaction with your work as the pardon attorney before this fateful half a dozen hours?
Absolutely not. I think I was well liked by all, and really had tried in good faith to work with the leadership to achieve their objectives and to find a path forward for the important work that the office does.
Yeah, and without making assumptions, this just sounds like a 2 + 2 = 4 scenario to me. And as a career former public servant, I'm not going to lie, it makes my blood boil because I know what public service involves. I know that the overwhelming majority of public servants are there for the right reason, to do the work of the American people honestly and apolitically. And, that is why I'm so dismayed at what's going on currently at the Department of Justice. So let me ask you, what happened when you were actually terminated? How was that news delivered to you?
So I first was advised by my colleague out in the hallway outside this meeting that there were security officers. She actually said U.S. Marshals because they looked very official, but they're members of DOJ's security staff. And they were waiting for me in my office with a letter that they had been directed to provide me from the Deputy Attorney General. And they told me that they were under instructions to watch me pack up my things and to escort me out of the building. I asked them why this was happening and why it was happening in this manner. And they told me they had no other information, just the instructions they had been given. I honestly felt awful for these two gentlemen. One of them I knew a little bit because he'd helped me with some things previously, and they were just carrying out orders that they had been given, and they looked absolutely sick over it. They could not have been nicer about it. They told me, take your time, take the time you need. We'll wait outside your door while you pack up what you need to do. I mean, they were as nice as they possibly could have been, and it really just illustrates, like behaving in this way that the leadership is behaving, it is traumatic to everyone, not just to the person who's fired, but to the people who have to carry out that directive and to the people who are witnessing it. The members of my staff who were in the office that day, I didn't have a chance to say goodbye to them. They just saw me walking out with my things. People were just stunned and in horror, shock, disbelief. No explanation was given to them after my departure. It really is just so upsetting and traumatic to the entire organization when something like that happens. It's not just me that is adversely affected by my termination.
And Liz, the termination memo said what and was signed by whom?
It was signed by the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, who I still have never met. And it stated that I was fired effective immediately pursuant to Article 2 of the Constitution. And it told me that if I had any questions, I could look at the website of the Merit Systems Protection Board.
Have you contested it? Do you intend to contest it?
I have appealed my termination, and that has been another source of frustration for me. I'm happy to talk about that if you're if you're interested. It's a little bit in the weeds.
Yeah, well, let me ask you this. You talk about the real world implications, not only to the person being, I will characterize it, wrongfully terminated, but so many other people. There are ripple effects. I mean, you talk about the demeanor of the two security staff personnel who had to deliver this news. And let me just take a personal moment here, but when it comes to leadership and supervision, anything I learned, I probably learned back in the Army in the 80s. And the three most important rules of leadership are support your people, support your people, and support your people. And the fact that somebody like Todd Blanche would have this, two-line termination notice that he didn't even have the courage to personally deliver to a Department of Justice employee says pretty much everything you need to know, I think, about the way the leadership, yes, I'm using air quotes, of the Department of Justice currently is behaving. But you've explained, I've heard you explain other real world implications to you and your family. For example, your health benefits, and how do you go about collecting up the information like your annual evaluations that you would need to even apply for future jobs. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. And I want to just say one thing about the point you made about leadership. There is no serious attempt by the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General to lead the Department of Justice. They are behaving in the mindset of to the victor goes the spoils. They're there to see what favors they can dole out to supporters and friends, to see how they can use the department's resources to achieve the political objectives of the president. There's no interaction between the leadership and the career workforce, and there is no serious attempt to lead the department. Um, and that's evident in the way that they're treating individual people, including myself. One of the frustrations that I had after my firing, as you mentioned, is I could not get any information from the department about even the most basic things. For example, I was seeking information about what happened to my health benefits. My entire family, as is the case for many government employees, was insured through my government health insurance. And so I needed assistance figuring out what my options were there. I also needed to get some basic paperwork. For example, there's a document I needed if I wanted to apply for unemployment. There's evaluations that show that my performance was rated as outstanding every year I worked there. So things that would help me to find a new job, to land on my feet, to take care of my family. I couldn't get even that most basic information from the Department of Justice for almost a month before they sent me anything. And when they finally sent it to me, it was because I had posted something about the situation on LinkedIn, which prompted a reporter to call the Department of Justice asking for comment on why they weren't providing this information. And that's what finally shook loose some of the documents that I needed. What they still have not given me is any information about the reasons for my firing. I made requests pursuant to FOIA, and they have not complied with the FOIA requests. I've also tried to get that information through the MSPB appeal. And the position the department is currently taking is they're asking to consolidate my case with the cases of other fired senior executives from the department, and they're seeking to stay the proceedings. So they're really just, they're not engaging in good faith in the MSPB process. They're seeking to delay and to avoid having to provide any information about the reasons for my firing.
Let's move on to some slightly happier topics. And I am, first of all, sorry for what you went through, for what you're going through. And I want to thank you for your public service, both as the pardon attorney and as a 10-year federal public defender. And let's kind of shift to that for a minute, because I would love for you to talk a little bit about your work as a federal public defender and how that experience sort of informed your work as the pardon attorney.
I did spend 10 years in the District of Maryland as a federal public defender representing individuals who were generally facing the worst time of their life. They were facing federal criminal charges. And in those cases, usually in the majority of cases, it really all came down to sentencing. You probably know this, but something like 97% of federal criminal cases result in convictions. And the real work of federal public defenders, the most important piece of it, I think, is getting a sentence for your client that fairly reflects their culpability and that fairly reflects any mitigating circumstances that may have been relevant. So we did a lot of work on sentencing, and there were times when the sentence that I was able to achieve for my clients really did not feel like justice. But as a federal public defender, you have very few tools in your arsenal. We resorted often to begging, pleading, groveling to make our clients' case, because there are all these sentencing laws, mandatory minimums, sentencing guideline enhancements that make the exposure just so significant in certain cases. So the reason that I was interested in the position of pardon attorney was because I had been, beaten up so many times in court representing clients. And I was just so in awe of the idea that the president had this vast power to literally correct an injustice with the stroke of a pen, which is what the constitutional clemency power can achieve. I first became aware of it when President Obama launched this historic clemency initiative and really used the clemency power systematically to correct sentences that were longer than they needed to be as a result of mandatory minimums primarily. So I was interested in getting into clemency because of the power that it possessed to really do some good for people who were serving sentences that were longer than they needed to be, or for people who were living with the lifelong stigma of a criminal conviction and really had no way to get that erased from their record other than the possibility of a presidential pardon. So I went into it with the mindset of looking for people who had been treated more harshly than necessary by the criminal justice system, or who had really just demonstrated extraordinary rehabilitation. And I wanted to play a role in getting those cases onto the president's desk.
Mm. And, when you use the term kind of the awesome power of the president to deliver clemency, to deliver pardons to people who are worthy of them, I also think about, maybe it's the flip side of the coin, the awesome power of the federal government to prosecute
Yeah.
people. I always tried to instill in my students when I was teaching at GW, when you look at the caption of the case, it is the United States of America versus Joe Smith. And that doesn't feel like a fair fight. It's a pretty lopsided affair when the United States of America has marshaled its resources and is prosecuting one individual. And that's why I don't want to dwell on this, but people, I think, sometimes misperceive the importance, the non-negotiable importance of zealous representation of defendants, obviously particularly indigent defendants, and the federal public defender service is going to be taking folks who ordinarily can't afford to hire lawyers. And I always tried to explain to my students that prosecutors have one job. It is to prosecute cases, marshal the evidence, see if they are worthy of both an indictment end a trial, do it honestly, fairly, while honoring the constitutional rights of the defendant. But we essentially had one job to do. Criminal defense attorneys, public defenders, really have two jobs, in my view. One, you have to zealously represent the interests of your client. But two, you, in a very real sense, are serving as a check against governmental misconduct, overreach, abuse by police, by prosecutors, occasionally even by judges. And that dual responsibility, I think, makes your job so much more difficult. And frankly, I think it can be a thankless job because people, want to say, well, you're just representing bad guys. It's like, no, no, I am doing some of the most important work the criminal justice system has to offer. So enormous props to you and to all criminal defense attorneys, both public defenders and CJA court-appointed lawyers, privately retained lawyers. So I think we all appreciate the work that you did for 10 years and what you brought to the office of the pardon attorney that was informed by that work as a federal public defender. But can I ask you, Liz, as we wrap up here, and I appreciate you being so generous with your time, do you have a sense of what is next for Liz Oyer, former pardon attorney for the United States?
I'm still thinking about how I fit into the justice system, the legal system going forward. It feels like the landscape is changing so rapidly, and things that I might have thought a few years ago would be good roles for me just don't feel the same way. So I really don't know what is next for me professionally, but I am committed to continuing to use my voice to advocate for what's right and to play my part in upholding the constitutional system that we have in place that is really under attack and under serious threat of being undermined right now by this current administration.
And that's why I think it's so important that, everyone stand up, speak out, hold strong, remain loyal to the Constitution. When I see DOJ attorneys going into court and either speaking the truth, as did the prosecutor or the DOJ lawyer in the Abrego Garcia case, only to be, yanked off the case and perhaps fired
Yeah.
from DOJ. I'm not sure if that person was terminated, that person's supervisor was retaliated against. And then you have lawyers going into court, including in the Abrego Garcia case, and you have judges making findings. I don't know how long Judge Sines has been on the bench in Maryland. You may be familiar with her. But when she makes findings like the DOJ attorneys are offering the court, quote, falsehoods, and they are acting in, quote, willful and bad faith defiance of her orders, essentially, of her discovery orders. People may not understand, but that is a potentially career-ending finding that a judge makes against the DOJ lawyer. That person probably will and should be referred to their own state bar counsel. In normal times, they would be referred to the Office of Professional Responsibility, which is like the watchdog inside the Department of Justice that is empowered to investigate allegations of attorney misconduct. But of course, now I believe they pulled the head of OPR, Jeff Ragsdale, somebody with whom I worked for decades at the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, out of that position. I'm not sure if they've replaced him, but sadly, I don't have confidence in the internal operations of the Department of Justice that are designed to keep the practice honest and ethical and actually representing the interests of the American people. But the one thing that we have is what you're doing, which is stepping up, speaking out about what's going wrong inside the Department of Justice, because there will come a time, I'm confident, that we're going to have an opportunity to try to fix it all. And I really look forward to that time. And in the meantime, we have to keep fighting in every way we can, in my opinion.
Yeah, Glenn, one thing that I want to highlight that's really kind of flown under the radar a little bit is there always historically, for I think as long as anyone who's still with us can remember, has been a career official in the leadership offices of the Department of Justice who has oversight of those issues that are truly non-political, that are essential to the integrity of the institution and to maintaining the credibility of the institution, like legal ethics issues and professional responsibility issues. There is no longer such a person. That career official has been sidelined, removed from that role, and those sensitive non-political functions have now been delegated to two of Todd Blanche's staff members, who are, one, brand new to the Department of Justice, have never worked there before, and two, uh, are relatively newer to the practice of law. One of them was a junior member of the president's defense team in the case in Florida. The other is, I believe, a 2023 law school graduate, and they now have oversight of ethics and professional responsibility matters and lots of other sensitive matters in the Department of Justice that previously were always entrusted to a non-career, I'm sorry, a non-political career appointee who could serve under any president. So that's a very alarming development and really speaks volumes about the approach that's being taken by the current leadership.
Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that. And to the extent I was finding reasons to be hopeful, maybe that I'm a little less hopeful. But it just, I think, requires that we all redouble our efforts and continue to speak the truth and combat lawlessness. And, I do think the rule of law will have its day again. It will come back into the light. And then we're going to have to be here to hopefully restore these institutions, particularly the Department of Justice, so the American people can have confidence and faith that we will be serving the interests of the American people, not of the corrupt president of the United States. So, Liz, thank you again. I'm going to say it one more time. Thank you for all of your public service across your many jobs. And thank you for being so generous with your time here with our Justice Matters friends today.
Thanks for having me, Glenn. It was great talking with you.